have reached the time of our channel migration of our channel migration zone mapping panel. And I think our 4 panelists, I think I've made all 4 of you co-hosts in case you need to screen share. I know a couple of you wanted to, you don't have to screen share, but if you need to or you would like to, you should be able to do that. And if not, let me know. And yeah, we'll, assuming everybody is pretty much back, we will start out just with a reminder that this came out of our conversation at our October meeting that I think well, I know Park and still, yeah, I think all 3 of the counties at this point who are affected by the floods are looking at doing, either updating or creating for the first time some channel migration zone maps to really look not just at the floodplain, but at where the channel has been in the past. And there were a lot of questions around how do we actually use these maps? How do we do some education and outreach around that so that people understand what these are? Because there certainly is some resistance and concerns and just not understanding what CMZ mapping is. And also just knowing how have other communities actually used these maps and what successes or not successes have they had with them. And so I was able to reach out to several people who have some experience in this. We've got 4 great panelists. I will let them introduce themselves as they come on, but briefly, and I'll just have them talk in the order that they are on the agenda. Briefly, we have Tony Thatcher with DTM Consulting, who's worked on a lot of CMZ maps around the state, has worked with communities to know how you actually can use those. And I think Tony will give us a good background on this. Then we've got Allison Martin from the Musselshell Watershed Coalition, which has existing maps in that Roundup reach and are working on in process of some newer maps. And then we've got Elena Evans with Missoula County, where they've done a lot with their existing channel migration zone mapping, and also Chris Scott from Gallatin County. And so each of those panelists will have about 5 minutes to speak, and then we'll just have a lot more time for Q&A discussion. The hope being that you can ask some direct questions of these panelists and perhaps of one another also. So, Tony, thanks for being here. I'll let you start us off.
Yeah, hey, welcome everyone. Thanks for having me here. Yeah, my colleague Karen Boyd and I have been involved with CMC mapping since early on here in Montana and have mapped a good chunk of the major rivers around here, and as well as up in the Pacific Northwest and a little bit in Wyoming and Colorado and stuff. So we're pretty well versed in how these things are made and how have been implemented over the years by different communities. And what's wonderful about them that we've discovered is that they're fact-based. They're based on imagery and historic imagery, and where we can measure distances of channel migration in different parts of the rivers. And when we show that to people, they go, "Oh, makes sense. That's yeah." I remember. Yeah, we lost that field back in whatever flood or whatever. And so they tend to be really not controversial at all. Versus a floodplain map, which sometimes can get kind of controversial because it's putting you either in or out of a floodplain. So just being able to stay with something that's really defensible and really visual and explainable, we've been able to work with people all across Montana, from municipalities to ranchers out in the middle of nowhere who are dealing with pivots. And so it's really been a joy to see this implemented and being utilized. The 3 other panelists are going to talk a lot more about how they are seeing things implemented. But for everything that Karen and I have done, we've just always had our doors open and phone lines open to chat with anybody about the mapping and even produce them a quick set of maps of historic imagery and what we see, and talk about issues, and people just can relate to them And so if there are any questions that come up about the methodology and why things have been done the way they have over the years, and why we're updating the maps on the Yellowstone River through Park County currently right now, feel free during the discussion to raise your hand, and I'll try and answer any questions.
Thanks, Tony. And also just a reminder, we're just going to let each of the panelists speak briefly, but if you have a question that you want to put in the chat while they're speaking, feel free. And then we'll let people actually speak and ask questions through their audio after the panelists are done. Let's move on now to Allison Martin from the Musselshell.
Hello, can everybody hear me?
Yep.
Alrighty. So, yep, I'm Allison Martin. I'm the coordinator for the Musselshell Watershed Coalition. I'm used to saying I'm fairly new, but I guess it's coming on a year now. So not super new anymore, but still getting the grasp of everything. So I've got a short little presentation. I'm going to share my screen with you. And I'll try and run through this as fast as I can. Let's see here. Alrighty. All right, so yeah, we actually just received our maps from the Army Corps last fall. So we've been working on CMZ mapping for a while now, for a few years, but we got kind of our official first set of maps this last fall from the Army Corps. But yeah, it was great that Tony went first, because I did steal some verbiage from Tony and Karen Boyd. They've done immense work in the Musselshell, so they have helped us with 2 different watershed restoration plans, which in turn helped with some of this CMZ mapping, this whole process that we've been doing. So just a quick little history of the Musselshell River. Musselshell River is approximately 9,500 square miles, drains from the Crazy Castle and Little Belt Mountains on the main stem of the Musselshell River. The confluence is the North and South Forks near Martinsdale, Montana. It's 340 miles long, and the Musselshell empties into Fort Peck Reservoir. It provides irrigation water for nearly 85,000 acres, 250 farms and ranches, and 388 water right holders, including 6 municipalities. So yeah, the Musselshell River and watershed is pretty heavy agriculturally focused. So yeah, traditionally the area's water users plan for much less water than normal because of the much more frequent occurrence of drought. But as of the past 10 years, the Musselshell is a prime example of changing weather extremes, with spring melts and runoffs taking place earlier in the year, unpredictable major weather events, and weather systems that change direction and intensity. So in the past 10 years, the Musselshell has experienced 2, well, more than 2, but 2 significant 100-year plus events. The biggest one was 2011, which was a 150-year event. At its height, floodwaters reached 2 feet higher than the previous record flood, which was in 1967. So the Musselshell River used to be kind of just a quiet, sinuous river, and since these 2 major floods in 2011 and 2014, it's kind of changed its whole geomorphology, and it's more of kind of a braided system, which is rare to see in a river, changing its actual sinuosity and changing its category of river. So it's now kind of like a big braided system river. There are 59 avulsions that resulted in the river channel being shortened by 37 miles. So with that being said, a lot more stream power that's affected the river in a way of erosion and sediment deposition. Total of 31 breaches occurred in the historic Milwaukee Railroad grade, and the Milwaukee Railroad grade has served as a flood berm for nearly 100 years. Here's just a couple of pictures of 2014 flood. As you can see, it's kind of well, of course now it looks like a big river, but even when the floodwaters went down, the Musselshell still is the Musselshell apparently, and I didn't know this, it used to dry up, like that was a normal occurrence. And now, since the coalition started, it no longer dries up, given a fairly normal year, which is pretty cool. So here's a map. This is northeast of Roundup. These light pink areas are avulsion hazard zones. So there's like 5 of these on the map. You can see a potential avulsion here. This is the 2019 this is the 2019 channel. So yeah, these maps have been pretty useful for us in kind of the planning of future projects, in a way of trying to predict where more and potential erosional hazards can occur in the form of working with farmers and ranchers and all these irrigation systems and irrigation structures that are in the river. So that'll be a big use of ours for these CMZ maps. It can allow us to open up strategies where we can think about management and knowing where the river may go in the next event, the next flooding event. Yeah, this map is beneficial for farmers and ranchers where river movement and erosion susceptibility appears high. The second map is east of Harlow. This map is a great view of a significant probable avulsion and future flooding events. Right here, they have this labeled as an avulsion hazard zone. And as you can see, if that were to happen and this meander got cut off, stream power would be greatly increased. And these are things that would be beneficial for us to use, again, with farmers and ranchers that are irrigating and have infrastructure in the river and just buildings in the floodplain, to know when the next event may occur. Right here, there'd probably be a lot more stream power, and then we could foresee what we may need to do as far as management and strategies to minimize next flooding risks and hazards. So CMZ mapping for us is used by local, state, and federal agencies, as well as private landowners, to better manage the Musselshell River, prioritize treatments that will conserve water resources, identify areas of evident channel stability that can provide effective renewable resource development sites that will have minimal impact on stream function, identify areas where channel dynamics support vital ecological function, where voluntary measures can be pursued to preserve river function and associated public and natural resource benefits. That verbiage may or may not have been from Tony and Karen. So agriculture use of maps, the water user associations are a big one for us to use the maps as far as floodplain and flooding mitigation risks, again, infrastructure and things like that. Helping landowners site ag infrastructure like pump sites, water lines, pivots. In 2011, that was our major flood. Several pump sites and pivots were replaced and then had to be replaced again in 2014 to 2020 because of continued flooding. So now with these maps, hopefully, we have learned a lot more about, again, irrigation practices and best management practices, conservation districts and 310 permitting, county governments for siting roads and bridges. The Cushman Bridge being a good example of having better predictive information about what the river will do to aid in making the decision about what to do with the bridge. So the Cushman, we have a bank restoration project just east of Lavina. It's called Cushman Bridge, and the river pretty much takes a 90-degree turn before it goes under the bridge. So these CMZ maps will be super helpful with that bridge planning and what kind of bank restoration to do before and after the bridge. We recently completed a floodplain encroachment project. So the engineering company and I use those CMZ maps to rank our encroachments based on feasibility and floodplain reconnectivity and watershed function. So that was very useful to move forward to prioritize what floodplain encroachment projects to pursue in the future. the Kilby Butte Bank Restoration Project. This was a potential fish bypass of the diversion, and maps helped. So Karen Boyd is really great in getting the word out that, I'm just going to read this right from her, but understanding of rivers regarding the risk they pose to infrastructure so that those risks can be managed and hopefully avoided. Furthermore, we believe that mapping supports the premise that managing rivers as dynamic, deformable systems contributes to ecological and geomorphic resilience while supporting sustainable, cost-effective development. So just really understanding the river geomorphology. So goals: continue bank restoration projects as it relates to erosional severity and the river's ability to access its floodplain to dissipate energy. Water users associations, talked about that. Flood preparedness in the future, landowner decision making, and then again, best management practices at a holistic watershed scale and conservation easement planning. So those are what our future goals are for getting our CMZ maps out there to the public and moving forward as a watershed to help in all these ways.
Thanks, Allison.
Yep, sorry, I may have
Yeah.
taken a little bit more time, but
That's okay. I let you go because we started a little early, so it worked out. And now let's go to Elena Evans from Missoula County. Thanks for being here.
There we go. All right. I shared my screen and then I had a hard time with mute. Anyway,
First goal accomplished.
here we are. So we had a minor-ish, like 25-year recurrence interval flood in April of 2018. So it was just the rising limb. And at that point in time, we had a series of trailers that were half in. A lot of the associated infrastructure, propane tanks, that type of thing had already been washed downstream as a function of the Clark Fork River migrating further into that bank. So on the left is looking downstream, on the right is looking upstream. We had disaster and emergency services, public works, the water quality district, all working to try and pull those 5 trailers back so that they hopefully didn't go into the river. It's pretty hard once they're in to get them out. And there were certainly concerns for downstream infrastructure and properties. This is what it looked like across the river. So you can see just how close all those different trailers were, and also just how high the Clark Fork was. It wasn't that high. So that happened 2018. The property went up for sale, and we had a series of people continue to be interested in purchasing it. And so, well, we concurrently worked with Tony and Karen to do a more extensive and comprehensive channel migration zone mapping. We also just did it in this smaller area, given the propensity of movement, and then also concern at having development again in that area, given what had previously happened. And so in essence, what this is showing is that we were kind of already integrating channel migration zone understanding into what we're doing with septic permits and things like that. And so it was certainly time to update the channel migration zone mapping that we had at a broader scale, and then also just better think about how we can make the community more resilient to what was happening and bring the expertise to daylight it for the citizenship, folks interested in buying house, folks who are already invested in their property and concerned about what was happening nearby. So if you look at this green spot, that's where we definitely saw some concerns. This is what it looked like on the ground. So water continues to seek the most efficient path downstream. And as a function, there was more and more capture in this side channel. And it is a place that Karen and Tony marked as an emulsion area. But this is something where when I went out on site with the property owners and we were talking about it, you know, they were interested in sandbagging it and preventing more water going that way, but because of how that works by just making hungrier water, sediment-starved water, by essentially straining it, it increased the time at which that avulsion would occur. So this is just an example of another property where we had a lot of interest in putting in a septic and folks doing that there, but the pictures showed more property there than there actually was. This is a picture of a well in the Clark Fork. And so that's something that we're hoping to be invested in not having happen moving forward. And then also just these visuals kind of help. It depends on what year you're looking at. On the left was the image that most of the people coming in for permitting were showing. On the right was not quite as good of a picture, but a picture of more along the lines of what was happening on site and how extensive that erosion was. And so kind of just trying to give people the maps and tools to find this information themselves and then make the best decisions as well. And so what we did after we got our channel migration zone mapping from Tony and Karen is we put it into our property information system and mapped it out so that anybody can see it. So you can turn on a bunch of different layers, and we do have some of the local planning and engineering companies and subdividers taking a look at this. This is just mapping the channel migration zone layers. You're also able to turn on the different years so that you can kind of see when that channel was last in that area. And then you can also pull up the floodplain map, because often there's some confusion in terms of how those interact with one another. Particularly in this area, as is down at the bottom, we have not only surface water flooding, but surface water that moves to groundwater that results in groundwater flooding of certain areas, and that's not protected by floodplain insurance. And so there's just like the whole gamut of water issues in this area. And so this map's been particularly useful there. This just shows where we have the channel migration and the floodplain mapping. So it can get kind of confusing, but all of that information is out there, and individuals don't necessarily need to hire a private consultant just for their own property to learn about that information. And that's important. You know, we had, this is a subdivision that people were interested in doing. This is the LiDAR mapping of that area. And that side channel is more likely to get activated. And so, you know, within subdivision, it's also the responsibility to reasonably minimize potentially significant adverse impacts on public health and safety. And with 2018 at the back of our mind, that was a concern here, given how fast we're getting erosion just downstream of that property. And so in part because of that, and in part just to try and make our community more resilient to the future, the planning department did incorporate riparian resource buffers and protection areas into the zoning update. And it's based off of the 2018-2019 center line and where the Clark Fork and Bitterroot have been previously. So it doesn't fully incorporate the channel migration zone, but it recognizes that where the channel has been previously, it will be more likely to go. And so there are setbacks off of that now for new development and development of a certain scale. And the goal is to hopefully anticipate or minimize the resources that'll go into the next flood and next flood. We can't really speak about that to this group, to a real big flood, and help out disaster and emergency services, as well as individuals who are putting all their time and money into irrigation infrastructure, utility infrastructure, septic wells, that kind of thing. So that's our brief summary, given that we'd already been using best available knowledge to discuss where septics and wells should be located. It was advantageous to demonstrate at a broader scale what that looked like with channel migration zone mapping and make that information available to the public so they can make the best decisions about what they're doing and protect those downstream and the community as a whole. So.
Thanks, Elena. And now we've got Chris Scott from Gallatin County.
Thanks very much. Yeah, Christopher Scott, Gallatin County Planning Department. I'm a senior planner as well as the assistant floodplain manager here with Gallatin County. We do have channel migration mapping for our major lower stretches of our rivers that are in Gallatin County, which include the Jefferson, Madison River, West Gallatin River, and the East Gallatin River. Those stretches, for the most part, do migrate, and we understand there are potential impacts from those migrations and those lower stretches of those rivers. And the biggest thing that what we've done, I believe that first off is we've provided education when people are inquiring about development along these stretches. We definitely make those channel migration maps available to them. And how we've implemented it, we have implemented it in our floodplain regulations as a criteria for any development that requires a floodplain permit. They need to identify and the location of the project as it relates to the channel migration mapping when they do exist. And so we do have that. We have recently put that in our floodplain regulations and require floodplain applicants to address that with the development of within the floodplain. In addition to that, we do mention it and have provided information in our growth policy. In our growth policy, in our natural environment, we do state that when considering subdivisions in our county, when there is channel migration zones that have been mapped, that we utilize that information in evaluation of a subdivision. So while it's not in any standards in our subdivision regulations, we have been successful in conditioning subdivisions to prevent development, any buildings, housing, or whatnot within those channel migration zones based on that information, and have provided the rational nexus between those maps with the subdivision and been able to condition those subdivisions with the mitigating natural impacts of natural environment, as well as public health and safety and wildlife habitat as well. So we do mention that. The other thing we have recently adopted is our sensitive lands study that was done in incorporation with I believe our city of Bozeman as well as city of Belgrade. It's more of a comprehensive in the lower Gallatin Valley here of information more as a resource. And what I'll do, I'll put we have a mapper that will show the channel migration zones. It's great to show that in relationship to the floodplain boundaries where we do have that, as well as buffers along those water courses to see how far those channel migration zones go out beyond a river as well. So you can compare between 500-foot buffer, 300-foot buffer, and see how those relate for the most part. But I think the biggest thing we know, with floodplain regulations, that is more of an elevation setback for the most part, whereas channel migration zones, knowing that people may be outside the floodplain because they are elevated, but we do know that they do have a risk, being that the migration of river can move and incorporate that area of land where they intend to build. So we do look at it, and it helps us justify more of a horizontal setback for development when it comes to mostly subdivision review for the most part. So yeah, that's pretty much my little bit there, how we've implemented it in our county, and I'll be happy to answer any questions, and I will put some of our information in the chat, some of the links to that sensitive land study and our regulations for anyone that's interested in taking a look at that as well. So thanks.
Yeah, thanks, Chris, and thanks for putting those in the chat too. That'll be helpful for folks to see. So that ends our panel. We're right on time. Look at that. Oh, and Elena's dropping some things in the chat too. But yeah, we are right back on schedule. And now we're just going to open up for questions of the panelists, general discussion around channel migration, zone mapping, use, education, outreach. And again, would like to prioritize the people in Park, Stillwater, and Carbon counties, but hopefully I think we'll have enough time for everyone's questions. And feel free to put questions in the chat if you'd rather, but also you're welcome to just unmute or raise your hand too.
Hi, everybody. This is Logan Beck with Clark's Fork Yellowstone Partnership. Can you all hear me?
Yes.
Cool. Yeah, we have a CMZ planning grant, and I'm just kind of curious, like what especially for like Tony and other contractors, like what your experience / thoughts are working with watershed organizations for channel migration zoning instead of like, you know, city planners, floodplain coordinators and things like that.
Yeah, I can certainly speak to that. In our mind, it doesn't really matter. I mean, whether it comes through a conservation district, a watershed group, or a city or county entity, in terms of the process and generally the end products, they're going to be very similar. Each individual watershed or water body tends to have its own nuances, its own challenges. I mean, currently for the Yellowstone and a bunch of the rivers going into the Yellowstone, is the most recent flooding has kind of set off a different understanding of what these rivers can do. That is quite different than what we've been seeing over the last 100 years or so. So that might lead to certain just kind of focuses that as we're doing the work, or as anybody is doing the work. Missoula County, as Elena was talking about, has those just development issues that are, smack dab in the bullseye of a meandering benway. And so those are critical things that we spent some extra time on with them. In the Musselshell, when we did the pilot study through Roundup, we focused in on the issues that were key in Roundup and the flooding that occurred there, and issues with the fairgrounds and levees and things like that. So every river has its own challenges. The funding organization is going to have its own desires of what they want to see out of that, and so anybody who's doing this, we feel, should be just working directly with those entities and prioritizing the kind of the analysis. I would say that the mapping process generally doesn't change all that much, but when we do a write-up, we will add a bunch of value-added stuff, discussions of places of interest, locations where they've been struggling with and whatnot, and just give those things a little highlight.
Thanks. It looks like Jeanette, I think that answered, I'm pretty sure that answered Logan's question. Jeanette, you had your hand up.
Yeah, can you guys hear me okay?
Yes.
I wanted to also just add just another way that we're using the updated channel migration map in Park County is going to be to meet with or talk with the department leads within the county and the city to talk about, like, just sit down with them, make them aware of it so that they can kind of start thinking about their emergency access routes and like whether there's critical routes that are within the channel migration zone that they need to think about, if there's infrastructure. And so identifying those pieces of infrastructure, whether those are bridges, roads, utilities, things like that, that are within the CMZ, and then kind of compiling a list of potential projects where we could pursue funding, and using this channel migration map as a way to kind of open up a new source of funding kind of related to disaster mitigation to help get some of these projects funded so that we can improve flood conveyance, reduce risk, and kind of upgrade that infrastructure where it's needed.
Thanks, Jeanette, for that extra info. Other questions or thoughts?
Yeah, I got one, kind of. So if the folks that have the CMZ stuff, how frequently are landowners considering it when they're looking at doing some sort of project or building? I mean, I'm still watching at, we're close to 2 years out from the flood, and there are new foundations getting poured right on the bank of the Stillwater. So setbacks are a thing, obviously, and they should, in certain situations. How much buy-in have you had from landowners using it? And then how much has the county or whoever in charge of those kind of things, have they used it?
Yeah, thanks for that question. So I think the key thing for us is that prior to moving some of the understanding of channel migration zone into like plannings, riparian protection areas and that sort of thing, we had been using it through either the floodplain additional criteria or through the septic incorporation of best available data. And so the rate at which we're incorporating the channel migration study hasn't necessarily changed significantly. It's just better known and better documented and more transparent in terms of accessibility to consultants and the public and everything like that. We had to draw those individual maps because we kept having people come ask us about whether or not they could put a septic in here, and the answer was, these are the setbacks from the well and all of that. So I would say it's just more transparent. The rate at which it's happened hasn't necessarily changed significantly, other than the fact that, we had a bit of a pandemic rush and a lot of more people moving to the area. So development increased, but the proportion is probably comparable.
Thoughts from the Musselshell or the Gallatin? If that's any different for you.
I can comment a little bit, and we tend to get a slow trickle with people coming and asking us about the mapping, and one of the ones was a landowner in he's on the Big Hole, and Classic wanted to build his house on the bank, and Karen encouraged him to set it back, and Karen got a very big thank you note the next year when that bank eroded back, like 30 feet. And so I think my sense is that they're getting used here and there. And there was one subdivision outside of Billings that we chatted with, and they basically changed their open space to be by the bank instead of having lots on the bank. And so things are happening here and there, and where every time that we can keep a foundation or a building from falling in the river, or help a producer locate his diversion or relocate his pump or something like that, and it avoids costs down the line, that's a bonus. And looking forward into the future, if we can just get more people more aware of these things and start making some better decisions, and give the conservation district some ammunition for saying, hey, no, I don't think it makes sense to rip wrap 1,000 feet of your bank. then it's it's kind of wins in little baby steps.
I'm seeing, it looks like Jeanette had unmuted and it looked like maybe Allison was trying to say something earlier. Allison, did you have something to add? I know development is not the main concern in the Musselshell. So I thought you might have a different view.
Yeah. So as far as the Musselshell, I was just gonna add one quick thing. I think that I have some more outreach to do as far as getting our maps out there. But I really think that once we do get our maps out there, I think a lot of landowners will be super interested in the maps for, like I say, planning of irrigation structures and farm fields and things like that. So I think with a little outreach, I'll get a good amount of landowner, farmer, and rancher interest in wanting to see the maps.
Great.
And I think in Park County, we're hopeful that with the update, my map updates that Tony and Karen are working on now, we do have those plans to reach out to the city-county departments, conservation district, and then also hold 3 public meetings within Park County just to invite the public, show them how the map is made, give them an opportunity to learn about it and understand how they can use it, where they can access it, and things like that. So that hopefully that will help get that awareness out there for folks.
Got it. And it looks like, I think that's Brooke from Clarksburg, Yellowstone with the hand raised.
Yeah, thanks, Terry. For those of you that are utilizing the CMZ maps, how are you explaining to the public the difference between that and floodplain maps? What kind of terminology are you using? It sounds like maybe outreach meetings are the way to go. We've had some folks obviously concerned about where the floodplain is going to go now. And we feel like maybe we'll have some pushback on the CMZ just based on the fact that folks are going to get mixed up between what a floodplain map is and what a CMZ actually is.
And I'll just say before, I definitely want to hear these answers, but there is a sheet that's in the invite and I'll include in the follow-up email to this that seems like a pretty handy visually based version of this. But yes, Elena or whoever was going to answer that question.
I could answer it. I mean, the simple thing I think I try to explain to the general public is that, floodplain information is again, elevation wise. You want to make sure they're elevated high enough. And they tend to understand that, whereas, the CMZ is more of a horizontal setback rather than an elevated setback. And rivers move despite where the floodplain is. They're going in that direction. You may be elevated. I think there's some great pictures of I think over in the Yellowstone of a past where they had to burn a house down, and that house was actually in order for it to not be a obstruction in the flood, but it was outside the floodplain. They're on the Yellowstone and I believe in Park County, and fell into the river, I think, and that was a perfect example showing how the river has moved. This property was not in the floodplain, and that's why a horizontal setback is and justified in that case as opposed to the floodplain. But yeah, try to distinguish between the horizontal versus vertical. I think is easiest for the public to grasp what the difference is there.
Yeah, I talk about your house getting flooded to a certain height or elevation depending on the flood, or depending upon how much the river moves, your house or your septic or your well being in the river. And so those are 2 different concerns from the perspective of folks here who are mostly worried about their house and their infrastructure. And then we can talk more about river dynamics and what that might mean, because we're also often then talking as well about groundwater flooding, which is its whole other can of worms, but something that we contend with whenever the river's high or whenever the river moves.
Great. Yeah, thanks for those explanations, both of you. Any other questions or thoughts? And I think we're also at a point where, if some of the non-Yellowstone people want to, we've got 10 minutes left here in this discussion. If non-Yellowstone people who've joined for their own information and their own watersheds want to chime in now, this might be a great time to hear your perspectives and questions.
And I popped it in the chat, but ours was done in conjunction with the Missoula Conservation District. So they've also used it for their permitting of irrigation infrastructure and
Yeah, thanks, Elena. That actually brings up a question for me that's probably mostly a question for Tony. How often, when you are called in to or hired to do these maps, how often do you see municipalities, conservation districts, watershed groups all kind of working together on this versus how often is it just one entity reaching out? And follow up, I guess, what are perhaps the benefits of working with multiple groups versus just one?
Yeah, I mean, obviously the contracting generally has to come through a single entity. So as a contractor, we're beholden to them but I mean, that's where this public outreach, it's not just public outreach, it's outreach to agencies, to, all stakeholders, all players, is so important because, fisheries, she was like going, yeah, let the river go, let's build as big a riparian area as we can, and all the bugs and bunnies and fishy will be happy. But that doesn't work so well for the highway department, or the producer or the rancher, so having all those people at the table and understanding and being educated just on river process, and that these are complex things, and when you start showing them very things that happen in their backyard or the next drainage over or whatnot, where houses that are 100 feet above the river are tumbling into the river. It's like, well, okay, I guess this could happen. And people just start having a different conversation about the whole thing. So I don't know if that answers your question.
Well, yeah, I mean, the importance of just everybody being involved in it.
Yeah, the bigger tent that you can have, as long as that as long as those people are involved in good open discussions and whatnot, and it's a collaborative effort, then we would rather have more input than less.
Okay, we've got time for Laurel.
Hi, I've got a question for Tony. So I was curious, talking with a couple other USACE partners, they have brought up the term fluvial hazard area opposed to channel migration zone areas.
Yeah.
I was hoping that you could talk about what the difference is, if that's something that you see floodplain managers needing, as we make all these decisions. What kind of effort is it? Is it worth, is it cost effective to go that route? If you could just touch on that, I'd appreciate it.
Yeah. It's a good question. I saw that it was on the chat there. Colorado, I think it's about 5 years ago, in response to a series of big flood events that happened right after some monstrous forest fires, brought a lot of water and mud and impacts to cities of Boulder and Fort Collins and a bunch of other places along the Front Range and in the mountains. And so they kind of realized that, okay, we've got a lot of pressure for development, a lot of pressure for use of these rivers, and we need to start addressing these at some level and giving municipalities tools for working with these kind of large stochastic events, like the floods or floods on top of wildfires, but then also, you know, the more kind of incremental events where a channel is just slowly moving year to year. And so they put together a pretty broad team of folks to just help them with input on that. And that included folks from in Vermont and New Hampshire back east, Oregon and Washington. Karen and myself were on that technical advisory group and whatnot. And they tried to come up with the Colorado version of what a CMZ is. They decided to go with the term fluvial hazard zone because they weren't specifically just looking at channel migration. And they wanted to include both flooding and migration risk, as well as, you know, just kind of big mudslides. They're getting into some things like the geotechnical setbacks in canyons for roads and things like that. And so they thought the fluvial hazard mapping was a better term for them than CMZ. They approached the process a little bit differently, and end up with a little bit different products when they're helping municipalities do this mapping, but ultimately it incorporates the same concepts. Rivers move, water rises, things get wet. There are mudslides that happen. We need to just be aware of these and start making better decisions and planning for the future, especially as more impacts, more pressure is happening on these rivers and along these corridors, and with the climate uncertainty that we're all just dealing with now, where we aren't quite sure what any particular event, whether it be 100-year, 500-year, or whatever, is coming down the river corridor. So that's I guess probably a little bit more long-winded than it needed to be, but.
All right, Paul. Oh, and you're muted.
This would be a question for Tony or anybody else that might have any thoughts on this, but in your experience with the channel migration zone mapping, do you have any statistics or observations on what you've seen as far as riprap revetment failing?
Yes, I mean we've seen it time and time again. Riprap fails. It gets flanked. There's places on the Yellowstone River where there's 1,000 feet of riprap, and it's 1,000 feet from the bank of the channel now. And it's, in all our mapping, unless it's a certified levee that's been engineered to a spec and is being maintained, we assume that bank protection is there. It may restrict channel migration, but it's not going to stop it. So that's kind of the approach that we take. We don't have any statistics on how much of it fails. It all depends on the river and the event. But I mean, along the Yellowstone, there are plenty of places in Park County that I'm seeing where riprap is getting scoured above riprap and below it. And then there are plenty of other places that I've seen where there's riprap that's protecting a bank that the river has moved away from. So.
Any other responses to that question before we wrap it up here? Okay. Well, I want to thank all 4 of our panelists for making the time here. We also had a little pre-meeting, so I know all 4 of them have put a lot of thought into this, and we really appreciate it. And because we have recorded this, we're going to publicize just this part, not the whole meeting, but just this part of the meeting. out to the wider watershed community. And hopefully there's some good information here for other folks, which reminds me to stop